All right. Where is the Antelope Valley? I'll have to just point here. This is the 5 freeway going north from Los Angeles. You take the 14 freeway all the way out to Palmdale, and then here's Lancaster, and up here is Mojave. I'll be talking about that. And then I'm going to be mentioning Edwards Air Force Base up here, and then a small town called Llano, and then about out in here is Helendale. And at about this point in Kern County, I'll be talking about a facility called the Ant Hill. The Antelope Valley can be very beautiful, as you can see, but also has lots of wind sometimes, and it gets a little warm. Believe it or not, these are some, but not all, of the aerospace companies that are in the Antelope Valley. Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing are all in Palmdale. The U.S. Air Force and NASA are out at Edwards Air Force Base. And then out in Mojave, at Mojave Airport, you have Scaled Composites, BAE Systems, and the Spaceship Company. So this is really America's aerospace R&D workshop. This is the Palmdale facility. It's on the Sierra Highway in Palmdale of Lockheed Martin. And the gentleman that you see over on the right there, on the far right is Kelly Johnson, who was the mentor to Ben Rich. Ben Rich took over at the Lockheed Martin Skunk Works when Kelly Johnson retired. You notice one of his quotes here. It says, Kelly Johnson said, "Be quick, be quiet, and be on time." Now, in the aerospace industry, they say that you can have schedule or cost or performance. And actually, you can have any two of those, but you can't have all three, if that makes sense. And if you notice, he says, be quick and be on time, that's schedule, and be quiet, but he doesn't say anything about keep the costs low. That's your taxpayer dollar in action. Lockheed Martin over the years has produced any number of craft, both aircraft and seacraft. Now most of you probably recognize the U-2 over here. This was why Area 51 was established, to be able to test the U-2, which was originally advertised as a high-altitude research aircraft. And of course, it was used as a reconnaissance aircraft over China and Russia. The craft in the right-hand corner is called the Sea Shadow. And about 18 years ago, I had a chance to ask Ben Rich, the former president of Lockheed Martin Skunk Works, about this, and he said that they built this for the U.S. Navy as a stealth ship, and he said they took it out for a cruise and checked it out and then didn't know what to do with it, and so then they mothballed it. Now, as a trained engineer, that's the last thing that any engineer who has developed a device or a tool or a craft wants to do. You perfect something and then they put it on the shelf. That's not what we want to do. Engineers want to prove it and use it. Keep that in mind. Around the early 90s, maybe 1991, I was at the UFO West Expo at LAX. And there were two gentlemen standing behind a table, and they had a big banner. It said, "Secret Saucer Base Expeditions." I had to ask what that was. And I introduced myself, and behind the table was Gary Schultz and Norio Hayakawa. Does that ring any bells with anybody at all? Yes. Where did you meet Gary? Norio. Did you? Oh, very good. Did you go to the ones that he organized himself, the two of them? No. Okay. They were in Los Angeles. Gary is the one in the tie. And I always mention Gary and Norio because they helped me sort a lot of this out. And it's not an easy thing to do. First of all, they said that they would take us to a series of secret bases in the Antelope Valley. They said that these bases were originally designed to do one thing, but they were also being used for doing something else. And that something else was basically developing and fabricating flying discs. So I said, well, I was living in Lancaster at the time. I lived there for about 6 years. And I asked them, well, let me join your tour. And they said, I said, where is it? And he said, well, we meet next Saturday in Lancaster. So I said, terrific. That's convenient. So this was the first a radar cross-section facility that they took us to. And that's officially what it's called. Basically, what they do is they mount on one of these pylons a model of whatever craft they want to test. And then they basically fire radar waves at that model, and then they measure the bounce back. And obviously, the less bounce back, the more stealthy that particular craft is. Now, Gary said we were going to go out and take a look at one of these facilities, and it had a moving building on rails. And we finally got up to a top of a hill, and this is the moving building. It's actually on rails. And what they do is they have there's a pylon inside this facility. They mount a model inside of it, and the facility, the actual structure, the shelter there is to keep them from being exposed to too much wind or sun or prying eyes like we were. And this happened to be owned at the time by McDonnell Douglas. And Gary told us that this facility had an underground structures where they were also building, as I said, flying discs. Well, that didn't seem to be too impressive to me, but one thing that did look a little unusual is from our angle, we were able to see the craft that was mounted on the pylon, but inside the building, and it had a manta ray design. This is a close-up of the Lockheed Martin facility in Hellendale. And it just shows roughly what they look like. Some are taller than others. And you mount a model. It could be full scale, or it could be quarter scale, whatever. It doesn't make any difference, really. And this is how they measure the bounce back of the radar signals. The next facility that he took us to was in Hellendale. Now, this is the eastern side of the Antelope Valley, and it's difficult looking at this photograph how big this actually is. There's one pylon here and one pylon there, and then this is the control area, the control buildings where they have the radar dishes mounted, and then they fire the radar down towards the model, wherever it might be. Now, in 1993, I asked Ben Rich, I said, you know, in Hellendale, you have a massive underground facility. Massive. And I said, what do you do down there? And he said, it's a model shop. Well, to get an idea of the size of this, just look at this structure right down here. That is the entrance to the underground facility. 2-lane road, a very large door, some model shop. Now let's talk about the Northrop Grumman facilities. Do we have any aircraft spotters in the audience? No? No one wants to volunteer? Okay. Well, the aircraft in the upper right there is not the B-2 stealth bomber. That is Jack Northrop's YB-49 flying wing, which was built in the late 40s. And this is a rather historic photo because this is Jack Northrop right here, surrounded by the B-2 design team. Now this is a photograph of the B-2. And on March 2nd, in the issue of March 2nd, 1992, I believe, issue of Aviation Week and Space Technology, there was an article that said that the B-2 leading edge was being positively charged. In other words, think of a battery. You have plus and minus, right? Okay, two different charges. And the article said that the leading edge of the B-2 was being charged with a positive charge. And it also said that the exhaust gases were being negatively charged, presumably for stealth purposes. Well, does that, do we have any physicists in the audience that might have an idea of what this might be? What is it? Exactly. I asked what it was, and he said that it's an electrogravitic propulsion technique. And let me explain this. This is a little hard to do here. Okay. Now, this is basically how it works, and it's called the Biefeld-Brown effect. And basically, if you have a metal plate like this on top, and you have another metal plate on the bottom, and you charge the top plate positively and the lower plate negatively, and if you put in a dielectric in between, a dielectric is simply a material that does not conduct DC current. All right, so you've got this charged positively on top, negatively on the bottom. The effect was that the disk will rise vertically. Or, put it another way, if you charge the front of something positively and the back of something negatively, it'll move in the positive direction. I hope that's reasonably clear. Now, what happens if the B2 there moves a little faster once you charge it that way? Well, what happens is it will make the velocity a little faster. Now, the B2 has 0.95 Mach, which means it's just under the speed of sound. Now, by applying those charges, does that mean the B2 is supersonic? I can't say that. But I can say that charging it with a positive on the front and negative on the back will create what they call a gravity well in front of the plane and a gravity hill on the back of the plane. And it will essentially, the B2 would essentially ride a gravity wave. And if the pilots pull back on the throttle, in theory, this might just ride a gravity wave once it's stabilized its speed and consume a lot less fuel. Think about it. Now, this is a photograph of T. Townsend Brown. If you'll notice, he's holding something similar to what I just had. And he and Dr. Paul B field discovered this effect. Brown started researching it in the late 20s, and they continued on until they demonstrated this effect to the Navy in Pearl Harbor in 1953, and then suddenly his entire project went black. In other words, no one heard about it anymore. Now, since we don't have any aircraft identifiers in this audience, to look at this little craft here. Any wild guesses as to what that might be? Well, that is a is a drawing that's been imposed on this, obviously. And this is the world's first stealth fighter bomber. Built in 1944 by the Horten brothers in Nazi Germany. It's the first stealth fighter bomber. This is what it looked like. It's almost like a mini B-2, isn't it? And I can assure you that before Northrop Grumman built the B-2, they fully studied the Horten 9. Sometimes it's called the Govt 229, and sometimes it's mistakenly called the Horten 229. Now, in the upper left-hand corner, this is the first flight of the Horten 9. I would imagine in around 1944. The photograph in the upper right-hand corner is what Horten 9 looks like today. You can actually see this at the Paul Garver Restoration Facility in Suitland, Maryland. This is a restoration facility of the Smithsonian. You have to make an appointment to go there, but you can see it. Now, remember, I just said that Northrop Grumman studied the Horten 9 very carefully. What you're looking at is a full-scale radar cross-section model built by Northrop Grumman before they actually manufactured the B-2, and they fully studied it. And as you can see, the lower right-hand corner, you'll see the full-scale RCS model mounted on a very large pylon in a facility called the Anthill. Now, when the Horten 9 first flew successfully, Reichsmarshal Goering gave the Horten brothers an immediate assignment, and that was to build the Horten 18, excuse me, the Horten 18 stealth bomber. Now, this bomber was intended to deliver the atomic bomb to New York City and Washington, D.C. in 1946. The drawing in the lower right-hand corner is modeled after many of the German plans that were found after the war. I don't know that they actually fabricated any flying discs, but they were certainly thinking about it. Now, one point that I'd like to make is that if Nazi Germany was concerned about intercontinental stealth bombers, stealth fighter bombers, what they call the death ray during the war, that would be a laser today. They were researching atomic bombs, the hydrogen bomb. Why not anti-gravity? Doesn't that make sense? Basically, gravitation had been studied. Gravitation had been studied since the 20s in Germany. Dr. Walter Gerlach led those research studies. And in 1944, allegedly, there was a Nazi German project, research project, located on the border of Poland and Czechoslovakia. It was located inside the Wenceslas mine, where they had located this device that you see on the right. It was about 9 feet in diameter and maybe 12 to 15 feet tall. And I might also add that it had some rather unusual script around the outside. What was this intended to do? What was that research project all about? First, they wanted to significantly reduce the amount of oil that was imported into Germany. Secondly, they wanted to research anti-gravity. And the third reason was they wanted to develop a war-winning weapon. They called it a Kriegsenden. Pardon the German, but that's as close as I can come. That means decisive for the war. And this was the highest level of priority in Nazi Germany at the time. Well, what was it? The outside shell was a ceramic. Inside, they had a device which rotated. There were 2 drums that rotated. And the liquid inside was what they called red mercury. It was cooled by liquid hydrogen or liquid nitrogen, and it was also powered by a high voltage line that came from a power station outside the mine. And when it operated, it put out a blue glow. Now, just outside the mine, there was this round facility, perfectly round, and it was in sort of a trough. And there were high voltage lines coming from a high voltage generation system that was also located very close by. Now, some of the local people said that they observed a dark barrel-like device approximately in the location of this circular structure that went up vertically to some height, hovered, and then came back down. I might then mention that Dr. Walter Gerlach and a Dr. Kurt Debus were 2 of the very few people on this team that escaped at the end of the war. Nazi General, or I should say SS General Hans Kammler assigned an execution squad to execute everybody else in this team. By the way, Dr. Kurt Debus was brought to the U.S. as part of Operation Paperclip, if you know about that. And he later became the director of Kennedy Space Center. And he was an electrical engineer, no less. Now let's get on to the Northrop Grumman facility. This is located just over the Kern County line. It's owned by Northrop Grumman, and it's called the Ant Hill. And according to the stories that Gary Schultz told me, this facility was built in 3 phases. The first phase was this section right here, and then some years went by, and then according to Gary Schultz, there were a number of concrete trucks that were lined up outside this facility. And as each truck approached the main gate, the driver would get out and someone else would take over the concrete truck, and they would enter this building here. and they would be basically lifted down to whatever had been added to this facility. Supposedly, there are 7 underground levels. And they brought in concrete truck after concrete truck, and so there is supposed to be, this is why they call it the anthill, this is supposed to be a large underground facility. The last phase of the construction were sections over here. Now, my former wife was a State Farm agent in Lancaster, and she still is. And so we met a number of people in the aerospace business. And one of them happened to be a pilot, and he called my wife one day and he said, would you like to go on a flight around the Antelope Valley? And of course we accepted right away. And I said, well, where can we go? Anywhere you want. So I said, okay, let's go to Llano, Hellendale, and the Anthill. So we flew over all of these facilities. Now, the day that we happened to overfly it, this was open. In other words, it was like an ICBM silo cover. If you can imagine that, it's sort of like a clamshell that opens up. In the case of an ICBM site, they open up the doors and then they launch the missile. Well, I could actually see these doors open, and of course it was black down there. I couldn't see anything more. But there is definitely a facility for opening these doors. Now, this is what Gary Schultz saw one evening when he was standing up on the hillside there, just watching the anthill facility. His claim is that he was watching this and the doors opened. He could then see a light inside and a flying disc elevated out and left the scene very rapidly. Believe it or not. Now, you can actually do that yourself. There is a plateau up above the anthill, and there is a road leading up there. It's not easy to find, but all of the directions to these RCS facilities are in my book, and that's described as well. Now, a little bit later on, a few years later on, I had an opportunity to meet Mark McCandlish. Has he had a chance to speak here at all? No? Yes? He's been here. Okay. Mark McCandlish is a very talented technical illustrator. And you've probably seen his artwork in popular science, for example. He had a very close friend of his who he met in grade school. And his name was Brad Sorensen. Now, as the story goes, this is sort of an anecdotal story, but as the story goes, Brad Sorensen was asked by Frank Carlucci, who was then the Secretary of the Department of Defense, to go with him to Norton Air Force Base. This is some years ago. And during the Thunderbird show, they were also having an air show. So during the Thunderbird part of the air show, Secretary Carlucci took Brad Sorensen to what they called the big hangar. And they walked inside. No one really challenged Frank Carlucci. And inside they had 3 flying discs, all in operation, untethered, hovering above the ground. They had a little bear, they had a mama bear, and they have a papa bear. Generally speaking, 25 feet in diameter was the smallest one. The next one was 60 feet in diameter approximately, and the other one was 140 feet in diameter, all hovering without any external power or support. Unfortunately, a friend of mine by the name of John Williams, who happened to be a colonel in the Air Force at the time, was actually based at Norton at the time. And unfortunately, he couldn't be here tonight, but he could give you the same story. Anyway, when Brad Sorensen got back and had a chance to talk to Mark McCandlish, he described what the smallest device looked like. And this is Mark McCandlish's version of that. This is a very large capacitor down here. These are oxygen tanks. There are 4 seats up here. There are no windows. Everything is done with cameras. This is like the remote manipulator arm on the space shuttle. It's in the storage position here, but it basically comes out and can grasp something. Now, this column contains something. Any guesses what it might be? Sorry? Well, that's part of it, but the point is it happens to be mercury. Does that ring a bell with the Die Glocke? That had red mercury inside. All right, we're now going to talk about the fairly well-known Ben Rich lecture in 1993 at the UCLA Alumni Center. I was invited by a friend, and we had no idea who Ben Rich was. It was supposed to be just somebody who was going to give a history of Lockheed Corporation and Lockheed Martin. But anyway, we went to such things and had no idea what to expect. Keep in mind that the Skunk Works manufactured the SR-71 Blackbird, and as you can see, the F-117, plus many others that I won't mention tonight. He started showing some slides, just like I am. And after a while, he said this. He said, if you can imagine it, Lockheed Martin has done it. Now, you know, I'm an old science fiction guy. As a kid who was 10 years old, right? And I used to watch all of the science fiction films and read the science fiction novels, and so I have a big imagination. That's the thing about science fiction. It opens your mind. And if you haven't realized that to date, you ought to look into it from that point of view. It opens your mind. Well, then he showed a few more slides. And then he asked the audience, how are we going to get to the stars? Now, someone earlier asked about this rocket that's supposed to go to the moon and Mars in 2025. Well, I've got news. We're not going to the stars using rockets and chemical propellants. Oops, sorry. This is the answer to his own question. How do we get to the stars? He said, not by rockets and chemical propellants, but by using a new technology. Then he proceeded with a few more slides. And then he said this: Lockheed Martin now has the technology to go to the stars. Was he joking? You know, was he joking? No, he had cancer. And he had less than 2 years to live. And to me, he was saying these things almost like a pre-deathbed confession. Now, what does that all mean to you, to anybody? Was he just making up to maybe increase the stock value of Lockheed Martin? I don't think so. Yes, what? How are they doing it? Well, it's basically, I believe that there are several different methods of achieving anti-gravity. And what they've done is essentially to retrieve crashed extraterrestrial craft and re-engineer them, retro-engineer them, understand how it works, and then build an alien reproduction vehicle. Now, the last slide in the presentation was this: an artist's conception of a flying disc. Does anybody have any doubts still? Okay, well, after his last slide was shown, they went through a Q&A, and the audience left the auditorium. And the person that invited me to this meeting, who happens to be Jan Harzan, the state section director for MUFON Orange County, followed Mr. Rich to the exit door. No one else was around. And Jan said, "Mr. Rich, how do UFOs work?" And Ben Rich said, "Well, you tell me. How does ESP work?" And Jan said, "Well, everything in space and time is connected." And Ben Rich said, "That's how UFOs work." Now, to me, that means that they travel by folding space-time, because everything in the universe is connected. Now, this is a photograph of Jim Goodall. He's a well-known aviation historian, author, and as you can see, he's restoring a SR-71 here. And he happened to be a very personal friend of Ben Rich. Unfortunately, the video that I want to show won't work. I don't think, but we'll try. And basically, I will explain what he said if it doesn't show. Well, anyway, it shows on my PC. Jim said that he was on at Ben Rich's last 10 days, basically at his deathbed. And he said, apparently, that what we've done is to retrieve UFOs, crashed extraterrestrial craft, recover them, understand how the engineering, and then recreate them or reproduce them. And they're called alien reproduction vehicles. It's too bad we don't have the video. Okay. Now, I'd like to talk about what I call the Ben Rich analogy. We have some of our greatest scientists and engineers here. Enrico Fermi, he was Italian. We have Hermann Oberth and a bunch of former Germans as our great German scientists. We have Carl Sagan and Ben Rich. Now, Enrico Fermi was very interested in, besides nuclear energy, he was very interested in extraterrestrial civilizations. And he did some calculations as to how many extraterrestrial civilizations with advanced technologies would be existing now. And he basically came up with a question: where are they? Now, who knows what he thought about UFOs in his private life, but in public, he did not acknowledge them. But that was his question. Sometimes it's called the Fermi paradox. Then, 4 years later, Hermann Oberth, who, along with Werner von Braun, who you can see just over his right shoulder there, and a few other German scientists and engineers. Hermann Oberth was called or considered to be by many to be the father of German rocketry. And in 1954, he said flying saucers are real and they are spaceships from another solar system. That's quite a statement for a rocket scientist that's fairly well known. So let's fast forward to Carl Sagan. If you remember in 1980, he would always come up on the show and say, well, there are billions and billions of stars. And that means there are billions and billions of planets. And Carl Sagan always acknowledged that many of those planets had extraterrestrial life, intelligent life, and technically advanced. But he would always say that UFOs aren't real because the distances are too great. Now we come to Ben Rich in 1993, and he says Lockheed Martin now has the technology to go to the stars. Well, what happened between 1954 and 1993? That magic 40 years? Probably quite a bit. My only question is, what happened with Carl Sagan? Did he lose the plot or what? Well, personally, I agree with Bud Hopkins. If you've read Bud Hopkins' book, Art, Life, and UFOs, Bud Hopkins was a contemporary of Carl Sagan. In fact, they even debated. And Bud Hopkins always said, well, Carl knew that UFOs were real, but he had to say that they weren't real because he was being fed and funded by the US government for his own projects. Well, what's the Ben Rich analogy? My only point here is that if in 1993 we had the technology to go to the stars, then it strikes me that any extraterrestrial intelligent civilization that's technically evolved, that's as old as our planet is, could easily come here. And if they're 1 million years ahead of us, then what might that mean? Does that mean that they've been here quite some time? Maybe? Well, think about it.